So, Rita, tell us what has made you so successful in your career?
Oh goodness. I think a combination of things, hard work and luck never hurts. But I've also had really great support from serious sponsors that I was lucky enough to be working with for many years. So my longtime co-author Ian McMillan was really very fundamental. And I mean, when I'm talking sponsorship, he took it seriously. I mean, he, for example, would tell people he's not going to come to their conference or speak at their event unless I was invited too. So I mean,
Wow.
that kind of thing is not normal. I think a lot of people have it much more. It's much more difficult for a lot of people. And I think having help at home helped too. My husband was very supportive and never really. I mean, it's always hard handling two job situations, but he was always very supportive of my career, and I think that has really helped too.
Choosing a partner is actually a business decision in a lot of ways, finding a supportive person.
The older I get, the more I kind of am just so stunned by how fundamental that is. And
Yeah.
I'm at the age now where a lot of my friends have had great long marriages, but now they're getting divorced.
Right.
And that's the other end of it, and you're just going, oh no. So yes, choosing a good partner is very, very important.
So, what advice do you have for young people who are just starting out and trying to rise to the top in the business world?
I think the first piece of advice I would give them is to try to develop as much of a particular kind of skill as you can, something that's useful. So whether that's being great at writing or great at coding or great at graphics or whatever it is, being able to explain to people why what you're doing can be helpful. I think also let's not forget the basics. Show up on time, keep your commitments, do what you said you were going to do. I mean, let's get the basics right, and then I think this notion of pursuing multiple paths I think is also really important. So don't just depend on one particular employer or one particular route. Keep yourself open to having multiple connections. And then I guess the final thing I would say is, everybody always says have a network, but it really does matter
Mm,
to have a network. And
yeah.
who and keep that network alive. And I mean, and I think being open to getting into situations where you're meeting people you wouldn't normally meet. So let's say you're a science graduate and you don't normally go to liberal artsy kinds of things, but being open to doing that once in a while can really open doors for you.
And we have so many ways to keep up with our networks now with social media and everything. There's really no excuse for us to let off on that, is there?
Well, I think there's also a delicate balance. You don't. I'm in a situation now where I get networked by a lot of people.
Ah,
They
right.
send LinkedIn requests and they, all that stuff. And I think it has to be authentic. People respond much better if there's a real reason why they would want to connect with you or share a common interest or something like that.
Good point. So, you're a professor at Columbia Business School. What to you makes a great teacher or professor?
Oh, well, it's changing, I think. We
Ah,
used to have this model of the professor kind of like monk in a monastery, right? And people came and worshipped at the professor's feet
the
and
ivory
sort of gave
tower.
great wisdom and yeah, and get
Yeah.
great lectures and how wonderful you were on the podium was a measure of what a great professor you were. So I think today, certainly subject matter expertise is pretty critical. But I think to really be an inspiring and great teacher, you have to care about your students. You have to put genuine time into understanding what they are capable of and challenging them, I think, a bit. But it's really that now much more two-way connection that I see the profession evolving into.
How does our typical view of learning need to change in order to prepare new leaders for this new landscape?
Well, I think learning, we're understanding now, has gone from being able to just sponge up information and regurgitate it on demand. It's much more about a continuous process of learning. So it's not like you learn and you're done. It's you're continually building assets of knowledge. I think new technologies have really changed the way we learn. So we're seeing a lot more learning in bite-sized chunks, learning on demand. learning when you need to use learning. So we're seeing the acquisition of knowledge and the application of knowledge moving much closer together in time. I mean, I think those are some big issues that we're starting to see.
So you're a worldwide expert on strategy and innovation. So I'm curious, you give a lot of talks, you consult, you're a professor, you write. How do you use these principles in your own business life?
Well, very much continuous learning. I read a lot. I'm always updating my materials and trying to figure out what are the new examples that are better than perhaps something we might have looked at a previous age. We're looking at certainly that two-way interaction is incredibly important. Even with big audiences, people still love to ask questions and feel that what you're communicating is tailored to them. When I give a talk, for example, I always do a fair amount of research on the industry, or what are the challenges facing the people in the audience, and I try to tailor the talk to what they're up against. So it's not just a generic kind of thing. In things like workshops and so forth, I really try to help my clients learn. So a lot of times I'll send them a few articles or things to think about and read before they actually get into the work. So it's really that question of connecting where they are coming from with whatever it is that I'm doing.
So I love that you were named one of the 25 smartest women to follow on Twitter by Fast Company.
That's right.
What is your secret to your communication via social media? And could you even share an example maybe of a smart tweet that's gotten you recognized?
A smart tweet, my goodness. Well, what I'll do is I'll sometimes, as I'm reading or see something that's interesting, I'll comment on that. Trying to think of what I've tweeted about recently. I'll try to bring out things that my audience may not have run across. So, just as an example, there are cases where a company gets into trouble, or there's something predictable, or something I would have predicted. So here's an example. One of the things we're starting to see now in education, and I know you're interested in education, is we're starting to see the ability to credential learning by the content of the learning. So you can actually say, well, I took this online course, I finished it in the top half of the class. You can verify that online. And so what that starts to do is that begins to erode the value of, say, a degree program. So right now, students have to get a bachelor's degree to be qualified for just about anything. Right. And it's because employers are using the bachelor's degree as a signal of being able to show up on time and having a certain amount of responsibility, being able to stick to something for 4 years. It's a proxy for all these other things. Well, once you can actually measure the presence of these other things, then the value of the bachelor's begins to erode, because instead of going to an employer and saying, I have a bachelor's that counts for something, I can go and say, I mastered this thing in creative writing, I also have this coding skill, I've also done this public speaking thing, and here are all the credentials that swear to the fact that I have indeed mastered those things. So I've been predicting for years that once we start to see real credentialing at the level of the skill, that the value of these degrees begins to erode. And so I ran across an article that was talking about this, talking about a new book on education, looking at this, how education's got to change because it's just too expensive and it's not really serving people all that well. So I posted a tweet with a link to that article and basically said, this is something I've been talking about for a while and now it's starting to happen. So that would be an example.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating.
I should say also, I do all my own social media. I mean, I don't have people that do that for me. So
wow.
It's also a great way to learn what people are interested in. You pick up on what they retweet and what gets favorited and what people send to other people. It's interesting to see what catches a nerve.
Why did you write The End of the Competitive Advantage?
I wrote The End of Competitive Advantage because I was starting to feel that strategy was increasingly out of step with what I was observing going on and with what my clients care about, and so forth. And so I really felt we needed a way of thinking about strategy that addresses the fact that advantages really, in many cases, just aren't as sustainable as they used to be. That advantages increasingly are kind of like a wave, so there's a period of time where they get conceived. We build them up. We have a period of time when we get to enjoy them, exploit them. But then, technology changes, competitors copy. The need that was being addressed disappears, and the advantage eventually goes into erosion. And what I found was people were trying to cling on to these old advantages, just sort of hang on to them, rather than being prepared to replace them with something new. And companies got themselves in terrible trouble by thinking whatever made them great once is not what's going to make them great in the future. Sometimes when I'm giving a talk, I open it up with a video clip of a 2008 interview that was done of Jim Balsillie, who is the former co-CEO of BlackBerry. Well, that interview was done in April of 2008, and Balsillie was asked, well, have you ever given any thought to what might happen to you if BlackBerry is not your main product? And he says, no, I don't think that way. I don't look up too much. I don't look down too much. The great fun is just doing what you do every day. Well, BlackBerry hit its all-time stock price high in June of 2008, just a couple of months after that interview, and it's been on retreat ever since.
Wow.
And I used it not to poke fun at Jim Balsillie because, I think the critical thing to realize with that story is in his entire experience with that company, there had never been a moment where BlackBerry was not on top.
Right.
And I think so. What I try to get people to say is, it's not that they're stupid people or bad managers. It's that this phenomenon has become so pervasive, and we just haven't really taught people how to deal with it. And so I thought the book would be a really nice way of trying to raise up the challenges and also give people some ideas about what do you do about it? Once you've named this phenomenon, what do you do now?
So what would you say is the central theme or thesis of the book?
The central thesis is that if you want to build an enduring company, you have to build a proficiency at finding new opportunities, at exploiting them, but also being prepared to disengage when the opportunity goes away. So you need capabilities at each of those sort of life cycle stages.
And we'll get into that in just a second, but who would you say is your primary target audience for this book, or are there multiple?
There are multiple. I think clearly senior executives and decision makers is clearly the people that can do something about this. But I also think it speaks to people building their careers. What kind of company do you want to join? What are the warning signs that maybe it's time to look for other opportunities? So, there's a big audience there. I think there's some possible benefits for entrepreneurs and people that want to do their own thing, and kind of what do you need to be paying attention to as you begin to innovate. So I think there are multiple audiences.
Tell us, what is a transient advantage, and how does it inform the process and the playbook that you lay out for strategy?
Sure. So a transient advantage is one that emerges, has its moment, in the sun. It's popular. It creates profits. It does good things, but then eventually it comes under pressure and disappears. And what you need to be good at, I would argue, is going from wave to wave of these kinds of transient advantages. So let's just take an example that everybody will be familiar with who's above a certain age, a dial-up internet, right? If you go back 15 years to the time period when America Online and Time Warner merged, only 3% of all households connected to the internet in the United States had high-speed internet. Everybody else was on dial-up modems. And during that time we thought AOL was the internet. And there was a whole host of people that grew up providing internet service providers with names like MindSpring and whatnot, and they did well. They earned their money by people who would pay. I don't know if you remember, but AOL at one point charged you by the minute for how much time you were online. That was that business model.
Yeah.
So that business model is now gone. One of the dirty little secrets about that one, though, is there are still people paying AOL for dial-up, essentially dial-up internet, even though they may have broadband or other things. They're paying AOL monthly fees because they want to keep their email accounts, but they don't realize they don't have to pay AOL. It's a big chunk of their revenue. It's funny.
Oh my goodness.
But that's an example of, it was once a major advantage. Today, it's still there, but it's not as dominant as it once was. And as the world has moved on, other things have taken that place.
So let's dive a little more deeply into the 6 elements that you lay out in the book. What is continuous reconfiguration, and why is that important?
Continuous reconfiguration means you're not letting your organization get too stable and too fixed on one set of structures or one set of behaviors. Instead, you're kind of adapting continuously as the world around you changes. So you might have people moving into or out of new roles. You might be, changing the reporting structure. You might be building a different kind of network. So it's a way of adjusting what you're doing, but not in these kind of big wrenching, fire the left-hand side of the building kind of downsizings. You're adjusting in a way that adapts your organization to what's going on around it.
And how does that practically relate to continuous learning in an
Well, because you're
organization?
not letting things get too stuck in their ways, you have to learn. You're sort of forcing people to learn new things by forcing them to continuously change.
You promote a healthy or constructive disengagement, which sounds so counterintuitive, but then it's so important. What does that mean, and what's involved in that?
So when you think about this idea of every competitive advantage having a life cycle, right, there's going to be a period of time when the advantage is on the run. So I'll go back to my dial-up internet example, right? By the time more than 50% of households have switched over to broadband, it's pretty clear that model's on its way out. So if you want to thrive as an organization, you have to pull the resources out of whatever you were devoting to promoting dial-up internet and move them into something that's going to be much closer to your future. And when I look at most organizations that have really gotten themselves into trouble, it was pretty obvious that the handwriting was on the wall months or even years before it finally showed up in their business results. And yet they didn't disengage. And so the tendency of companies is to hang on to something for far too long. Or if they do disengage, it's horrible. It's firings and people get handed pink slips and it's very traumatic and nobody ever wants to discuss it again. And one of the unfortunate things is that a lot of what is valuable about a company often gets thrown out, even though you might still have some value left. So a great example of this is the mapping company Rand McNally.
Yeah.
It's a very familiar brand name, right? Well, in a world populated by initially MapQuest and then Google Maps and then, little devices and GPS, paper maps, again, they're not gone, they're not dead completely, but they're certainly not going to be drivers of your future profitability. Well, Rand McNally went through a really ugly process, eventually went bankrupt, got picked up by this very interesting private equity firm that invests in distressed assets called Patriarch Partners. And when Patriarch Partners kind of looked at what they bought, they realized that the Rand McNally brand name still had a lot of currency with many categories of users. And so the company's back now, but they're making specialty mapping devices for truckers, for example, or for people that own RVs. Because the generic GPS devices, if you're driving a big 18-wheel rig, it may take you down a road that you're not allowed to drive on. It doesn't have some of the special features. It may not tell you where you can buy fuel most efficiently. So what they've done is they built in all these features to make that for that particular segment, to make them willing to pay again for something that's there. But had Rand McNally just been allowed to go bankrupt and not, if somebody hadn't thoughtfully sort of said, what do we have here? All that value could have been destroyed.
What are some of the early warning signs that you talk about that leaders should be looking for?
Some of the really early warning signs are when customers start telling you that a competitive offer that's cheaper or simpler is good enough, that they don't really need all your bells and whistles anymore. Another one is on the people side, when your staff are leaving for other opportunities, good people you want to keep. Headhunters aren't calling your people, you can't hire the ones that you want to attract. So there's a whole kind of human talent dimension to this that I think is really important to think about. When your expectations for either growth or development are kind of leveling off, and you're not seeing the appreciation that you used to see in your core business. So those are some early signals I would look at. They often are evident long before it shows up in your numbers.
You talk about deft resource allocation. What is this, and what role does it play in this new framework?
Well, deft resource allocation gets at the issue that in a lot of traditionally run companies, the people that run big important divisions are allowed to determine where those resources get spent. So, a historical example I often use is, imagine you're Mr. Walkman at Sony, right? And somebody comes to you and says, hey, the future is electronic music distribution and albums are going away and no more AA batteries and, that kind of thing. You could be forgiven for thinking that's not such a great sounding future. And so what I argue is that in companies, you need some other party, some third party, either the CEO office or maybe it's the head of strategy, but you need somebody looking at the whole company and saying, where are there growth opportunities I should be resourcing more? Where are things eroding and I should begin to take resources out? But you need to have a real portfolio view. And I think that's where allowing individual business units to control the resource allocation flows can be a disadvantage.
So, how would you say does an organization start to build proficiency in innovation?
In innovation? Well, people often misunderstand what innovation really is. They think it's about getting great ideas. And sure, that's part of it. But in my experience, most companies have more great ideas than they'll ever be able to execute. More ways that they can serve customers, more ways that they can find opportunities. So really, innovation has three practices that are critically important. The first is indeed getting ideas, ideation. But then there's this very subtle practice of incubation, which a lot of companies are not very good at. So this is piloting, building customer understanding. Many people talk about the minimum viable product. How do you get something in front of a customer? Prototyping. And then eventually, when you've got something that you think could be a business, it's then accelerating. So how do I now ramp it up and get it to knit with the rest of the company? Because after all, that's the point. So I think you need to think about how you build proficiency at each of those. So how do I get good ideas? How do I screen them? How do I experiment with them so that I see whether or not a customer really is going to respond? And then once I've got something that's working, how do I now bring it into the mothership, as it were? And there's some interesting ways companies have started to practice some of those techniques. So one company I'm working with now is actually a Silicon Valley incubator. It's called Mach 49. And what they do is they help companies indeed find the ideas, but then they take whole teams, bring them to Silicon Valley for 3 months to do the incubation part. Because most companies aren't very good at it. So they put them in an incubator. It's kind of like Y Combinator for the Global 1000. They put them in an incubator and they get coaches and they meet Silicon Valley people and they learn how to prototype and they get people they call makers to come in and make stuff for them. And the concept is that at the end of the 3 months, they'll have done that hard work of incubation and they will be returning as sort of people ready to grow a business to the parent company, which I think is a really kind of fun and new approach to thinking about that incubation challenge. The other big issue that a lot of companies run into is the people that are running the acceleration part of innovation are probably not the same people that you have doing the ideation part. People that like to start with a blank sheet of paper are not people that want to go out and build supply chains and show up at, buyer meetings and negotiate requirements contracts. It's a different kind of personality. So you have to give a lot of thought to how the people change as you go through the life cycle of an innovation.
On a somewhat related note, in the book you talk about how letting a small group of people develop strategy is really risky. And I think that's a little bit counter status quo out there. Can you talk a little more about what you mean when you say it's risky and how to sort of mitigate that?
Well, I think the nuance is that you want people that are tuned in to the environment, paying attention, getting that input back into the strategy. So I don't think you can make strategy with a staff of thousands. I don't think that's going to work. But what you want to make sure of is that the people that are actually making strategic choices are deeply connected to what's going on elsewhere. So there's a wonderful example going on right now. As you know, Target's CEO has left and they've got a new guy in. And the new guy has done the unprecedented, right? He's walking around in actual Target stores, meeting actual Target customers.
Oh my goodness.
I know, he's seeing for himself what's going on. And the previous person, for a lot of good reasons, I'm sure, had always, told the store manager when he'd be coming, and all the staff knew, and the customers he got to meet were sort of handpicked. And he wasn't getting authentic information about what was really going on in the stores. And today, I think what you have is not only the ability to physically go and see what's going on, but you've got social media where people will talk about, especially people that are your fans, will talk about things they like or don't like about what you do. So I think a strategist today has to be tuned into that sort of input, not overreact to it, because customers aren't always right and not all customers are represented, but at least be aware of the flows of information that could inform what you're doing. And I think that's a pretty critical skill that you need to have. So it's not so much how many people, it's are you connected to what's really going on.
Talk to us a little bit more about the recommended shift in leadership that you talk about and the mindset of companies who are dealing with transient advantages.
Well, one of the things that I think is a big shift is that we used to think of really great leaders or managers as people who drove the results that they predicted, right? So I said this thing would launch in the fourth quarter of 2015, and it did, and so I'm a good person.
Right.
One of, you know,
That's so true, the way
it
you said
is.
that. Yeah.
And increasingly, what I'm seeing today is not that that's bad, and we want to keep some of that because you want accountability and you want people to, as much as they can, do what they say. But I think there's another dimension that starts to become important, and I call it being discovery driven. So when new information comes in, are you kind of, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, I'm going to stick to what I said I was going to do? Or are you open to the idea that new information may be kind of important to your strategy? So let's take something specific. For years now, we've been hearing about how the world is flat and all the growth is going to come in the emerging economies, and that's where you should be putting your resources and your people. And for some companies, that has turned out to be true. But for a lot of companies, the so-called BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, have been just forays into massive amounts of disappointment. So you take somebody like Walmart as an example. I mean, they've been trying to crack India for 20 years, and it just has defied them. And so if you are the CEO of a company like that and you start to get new information that the expectation everybody had was that this is where the growth was going to be, and you get the input that that's maybe not where the growth is going to be, you need to be able to adjust your strategy accordingly. So I think being discovery driven and open to new information starts to become pretty important.
What would you say you would want to be the biggest takeaway from your book after someone reads it? What do you want them to really just walk away with?
I want them to think about transient advantage. And I want them to also think that this isn't terrifying. I mean, this doesn't have to be an awful, awful thing. I mean, it is reality. And some parts of it are tough, given how many of us were trained and what we've been brought up to believe. But it can be dealt with. And I think the better leaders are going to be seeing opportunities in this new kind of way of thinking about strategy.
We have just a few more minutes, so if there's, anything else that you think is a concept we should bring forward.
Well, there is actually, and it's a part of a research project that I'm beginning to work on, which is about good jobs.
Good jobs?
Good jobs. And I think one of the risks that the transient economy creates is that many employers are going to use a lot more temporary people. They're going to use a lot more people with flexible skills, and that can be okay. But for a lot of people who don't have a rare or unique skill, what ends up happening is they end up stuck in these pretty awful jobs.
Right.
And so one of the things I'm working on with a couple of colleagues is we're calling it the Good Jobs Strategy. And one of my colleagues is Zeynep Tom. She's from MIT. And she's done a lot of work showing that even in sectors of the economy which compete on low prices, that employers can create the conditions for good jobs. And if you combine good jobs for people, which involves decent pay, predictable working conditions, reasonable flexibility in what they do, but you have to combine it with excellent operations. And if you get those two things right, you can actually outperform rivals who are faced with workforces that are just constantly churning over. They're not really motivated. They're so stressed out by their working hours that they don't really put in a full day at work. So we're trying to really flesh that out and start to think about, well, what kind of jobs do we want our employers in our economy, to be able to offer people? And I really think that accepting this notion that bad jobs are just a function of low-priced service work and that it's inevitable. I don't believe that. I think there are ways that we can address that. And so that's something I'd really like to see become part of the discussion, because there's no excuse in this day and age for American workers having so many truly horrible jobs that hold them back.
Yeah, that makes me think about, recently in New York, so many fast food workers, for instance. I mean, first of all, that's becoming more of a primary job instead of just a job that you work through college on or something.
Right.
So I'm thinking about that type of industry and the workers, rallying for a better wage. What's your thought on that sort of wave across the country that's been happening?
I think it's going to be more and more part of the discussion, and there are some drivers for that. I think the first is that, as you said, jobs that are paid as though you're a teenager working after high school are now supporting whole families.
Yeah.
Many of them single parent families. And I just think that's a sea change. I think the second thing is that when you look at our economy and you look at where the growth is, an awful lot of the growth is in things like healthcare, fast food, those kinds of industries which traditionally have paid very badly. And I think the third thing is that we're now starting to see, I think, some pushback from trends that have been accumulating for some time. So the decline in unions, the decline in manufacturing jobs, which traditionally were better paid than these service jobs, the kind of globalization. And one really interesting victory that has happened is in Los Angeles, or a suburb of Los Angeles, where there's an organization whose name escapes me for the minute. But what they did was really smart. They said, we want to raise the wages of workers in hotels. Cleaners, people that do the gardening and the maintenance and all that stuff. And they campaigned the local legislature. So this wasn't like a national thing. They campaigned the local legislature, the local city council, to raise a standard wage for people working in the hospitality industry. But one of the things they did that was super smart was they wrote notes to each of these public representatives. And they said, here's the number of people who live in your district who would be affected by this law, and here is the net income benefit to your district for raising this wage. And they passed it. It passed. Now, what I thought was interesting was it was a couple of dimensions. Firstly, they didn't try to boil the ocean. They were very specific about which sector they focused on, and they were very direct in terms of pulling every political lever that they could to get this to happen. And I think we're only going to start to see more of this because it's too pervasive an issue not to get more traction. And I think rising income inequality adds to the whole discussion.
And what do you think about the whole argument that things like small businesses, etc., would, if they made some of these changes, it might be to the detriment of their revenue stream or their ability to stay open? There's always that debate going on.
Sure.
What's your
and
take?
I have sympathy for small entrepreneurs and business people. I mean, I get that. But if you think about it as a system, I think it's a little disingenuous to say, well, if I pay this person $1 more an hour, it's going to come right out of my pocket, because it's part of a whole system. Right. If everyone in your ecosystem is getting paid that extra $1, those are more potential customers. Those are more potential sales. So I don't think you can just look at it at the cost line. This goes back to my good jobs thing, which is employers are used to thinking about human beings as units of cost, and they just put them right over on the cost line, and then it seems like good strategy to cut back and limit and whatnot. But what a lot of the research we're working on suggests is that actually employees, properly paid, trained, and motivated, are actually units of revenue. So here's an example. If you go to your local IKEA, right, one of the most complex things that are for sale in IKEA are the inserts that you use to make your closets more usable. So like a California closet.
I need one of those here in New York.
Absolutely. Well, who doesn't? Well, what IKEA learned was that customers would come, but they found it confusing. They didn't know what parts they needed. They weren't sure what measurements to take. And so that area just kind of underperformed the rest of the store. And what they learned when they started to staff that section, sales went right up. The whole area turned over more rapidly. Their inventory moved better. And the difference was that knowledgeable salesperson could actually create a sales environment. Wow. And we've seen this over and over again. I mean, if you go to, remember Circuit City? Well, the CEO of Circuit City got rid of all the experienced people who knew what they were doing and replaced them all with supposedly cheaper, but inexperienced people. The Home Depot went through the same thing. I mean, Home Depot's selling value proposition for many years was you go to a Home Depot and you'd find someone who had been a plumber or been an electrician or been in construction who could tell you what to do. Well, they wiped out all those people, brought in inexperienced people, and pretty soon Home Depot had no differentiation and people just stopped going. So in the short term, it can look like a savvy cost-saving move, but if you think about the health of your business over the long term, in a whole system, you really need to be paying attention to the systemic effects.
So what's on paper doesn't really translate into that relational type of relational-based revenue stream.
Well, people don't see it because they don't measure it.
Yeah.
And if they're not measuring it, even Home Depot looked really profitable for the first couple of years this was put into place.
Okay.
Right? It was only over time that customers started to say, I don't like to go there anymore. The lines are too long. I don't get good advice. For the same price, I can go to Ace Hardware and find somebody knowledgeable.
Right. And so many of the Home Depot ad campaigns are really based on that person in the aisle talking you through a
Well, they
purchase.
discovered they needed to go back to that.
Yeah. With job numbers, ever since the financial crisis of 2008, it's been such a struggle, and we're starting to see those inch up a little bit. But what do you think is the role of sort of a skill gap in our country? The jobs that are out there, maybe there aren't enough, maybe they're very high tech, maybe there aren't enough people to fill them and keep them. And sustain those types of jobs. What's your view on that?
Well, like many people, I would argue that we have really suffered in terms of our basic education system. And there's a lot of reasons for it. There's entrenched interests and the fact that we fund our schools often through property taxes, and so you have this inherent inequality in the schools. But if I look at a district like Washington, D.C., which Michelle Rhee some years ago famously tried to convert, they were spending, if memory serves me, $41,000 per pupil in that school system, and it was completely broken. So there's a lack of basic education. So I think that's problem number one. Problem number two is, and I think this is a downside of the transient advantage phenomenon, which is employers' basic position is, look, if I invested in training and I invested in developing people, I used to benefit from that. Today I train and invest in people and they leave me 2 years later and go work for somebody else. So I'm not going to make the investment. Now the negative cycle this creates is, it's sort of like, they call it the tragedy of the commons, it's like, which is a historical reference to, if there was a pasture in a town and everybody was just allowed to graze their cows willy-nilly, eventually the pasture became, was ruined, and nobody could graze there anymore. So what's happening now is everybody's sort of looking to the other guy to do the training and development, and nobody's willing to do that. So there's a real gap that's emerged. And so a number of interesting phenomena have arisen to address that gap. The first is we're seeing a lot more trade and skill-related training being done by community colleges and organizations like that in partnership with companies. So in Georgia, for example, Caterpillar has partnered with one of the local community colleges, and they provide the actual equipment that trainees would be working on in the facility if they eventually ended up getting a job. Yeah, so you're starting to see more of those partnerships. You're also starting to see students take matters into their own hands, and they're beginning to take skill-based courses even after they've gotten their BA. So code academies or some kind of scientific thing, they're 6 to 9 month kind of courses, but they provide an employer with a statement of this person's mastery of that credential. So I think it's kind of sad that somebody who has a bachelor's from a respectable school can't get a job without doing this, but that seems to be more the reality. So I think we're going to start to see a lot more of these kind of intermediate skill building alternatives to our traditional education path.